The Manchester Man by Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks. Chapter 5. Ellen Chadwick. The song of the human throstle was heard no more, floating across the batting frame out of the window of its cage, in the dreary yard, on the banks of the Irk. The swish of the wands might be heard, when other sounds were low, but no more snatches of melody flowed in between. Kind-hearted Mrs. Chadwick had not been content to leave poor Bessie at the breeches maker's when her swoon was over, but seeing that the girl continued in a dazed kind of stupor, sent to the adjoining Sun Inn for cold brandy and water to stimulate the dormant mind. Bess drank, half unconsciously, and Mrs. Chadwick, leaving her little daughter Ellen to amuse astonished Jabez, waited patiently until the young woman could collect her ideas, and not only tell where she lived, but prepare to walk home. By that time the road was tolerably clear. Mrs. Chadwick thanked the breeches maker, and bidding Miss Ellen march in advance with little Jabez, herself out Bessie Clegg homeward. She never asked herself why or wherefore the girl had fainted, or whose the child she carried in her arms. She merely saw a modest-looking young woman, stricken down by illness or distress, and put out a Christian hand to help her. It was past Simon's dinner hour, and they found him on the lookout for the absentees. He was more bewildered than Bess when he saw her brought home, pale and trembling, by a stranger, whose dress and manner bespoke her superior station. Mrs. Chadwick explained, seeing that Bess was incapable. The poor girl fainted almost opposite to the college gate, as she watched Earl Wilton's regiment march past. She recovered so slowly, I was afraid to let her come through the streets unprotected, especially as she had so young a child in her charge. Simon thanked her, as well he might. Benevolence will relieve distress with money, or passing words of sympathy, but it is not often silken skirt and satin bonnet walked through a crowded thoroughfare, in close conjunction with bonnetless cotton and linsey. Yet Simon was utterly at a loss to account for her swoon. He could only conjecture that she had missed her sweetheart from the corps, and that the enquiring volunteer had been a comrade sent to announce Tom Hume's death. Observing how much he was confounded, the good lady thought it best to retire and leave them to themselves. "Come, Helen, it is time we went home." But Ellen, seated on a low stool in the corner, had her lap full of broken toys, which had found their way hither from the Clough nursery, and which Jabez displayed to all comers. "My daughter appears wonderfully attracted to your little grandson." "He's no grandson of mine, missus, though I think I love little lad as much as if he did belong to us. I just picked him out at water in great flood about 2 years and a half back. I dunna know really who young un belongs to." "And you have kept him ever since, through all the trying time of scarcity?" "Yeah, I could do no other, and a little chap like Jabez couldn't eat much." "It does you credit," said the lady. "Maybe, I dunno know. I dunna see much credit in doing one's clear duty, but I think there'd have been discredit an I hadn't a done it." "I wish everyone shared your sentiments," replied she. By this time the little girl had relinquished the toys, kissed the little boy patronizingly, and was by her mother's side ready to depart. A word of sympathy and encouragement from Mrs. Chadwick, and father and daughter were left alone with their new sorrow. Sorely puzzled was Simon to account for Tom Hume's strange conduct. He could only come to the conclusion that he'd picked up a fresh sweetheart in Ireland, and was ashamed to show his face. "And if so, lass, you're best off without him," said he. The stern, troubled look on the young volunteer's face, which Bess had seen, and her father had not, he could not understand, and therefore could not credit. One day the girl said, as if struck by a sudden thought, "Feyther, I saw Tom look hard at Jabez. Dun you think as how he fancied our wed?" "He might, lass, he might," said he, knocking the ashes out of his pipe. "But dunna thee fret, I'll look Tom up and set it all right, if that's all it is." But there was no setting it right, for by that time Tom had left the corps and the town, and thenceforth Bessie's musical pipe was out of tune and stopped utterly. She worked, it is true, but she had no heart in her work, and though before her father she kept up a show of cheerfulness, in his absence she shed many and bitter tears. Smiles and tears are among a child's earliest perceptions and experiences. Of the mother's smile in its full sense, Jabez knew nothing. With all her winning ways, Bess could never supply that want, if want it could be, where it was never missed, having so good a substitute. But of the change which came over her when she knew that Tom was indeed lost to her, even the 3-year-old child could be sensible. He had been early taught to show a brave front when he hurt himself, and the starting tears would subdue to a whimper. But for all that, tears to him meant pain or disappointment, and as they fell and wetted the not always clean little cheek laid lovingly against hers, a tender chord was struck. He would press his small arm tighter round her neck, and with a sympathetic "Don't cry, Beth," nestle closer and try to kiss away the drops, which only fell the faster. Low-spirited nurses do not make lively children, and Jabez, after a stout tussle with the whooping cough, began to droop as much as Bess. So clear-eyed Simon instituted a series of Sunday rambles for the three, in search of plants and posies to brighten their dull home, and of bloom to brighten the fading cheeks. Sometimes Matt Cooper, with 1 or 2 of his youngsters, would join them, but not often. Sal was so jealous of his friendship with the Cleggs, and the pleasant day was so certain to be marred by an unpleasant reception in the evening at home. These summer walks seldom extended beyond Collier's Clough and Quarries, or Smedley Vale, or through the fields to Cheetham Hill, stopping at the Cow and Calf to refresh and rest the little ones, before they came back laden with wild flowers down Red Bank and over Scotland Bridge to their respective yards in Long Millgate. At first, whenever they took the pleasant lower road through Angel Meadow, they did their best to ferret out the parentage and connections of Jabez, hoping by their inquiries even to keep alive the memory of his marvellous deliverance, so that in case the missing father should return, there might be a mutual restoration. These Sunday excursions did not drop with the sere autumnal leaves. A crisp, clear day called them forth surely as sunshine had done, Jabez mounting pickaback on the shoulders of Simon or Matt when his little feet could no longer keep up their trot besides the bigger Cooper boys. Frames were invigorated, cheerfulness came back to face and home, and Simon, who had a deep-seated love of nature in his soul, finding her so good a physician, kept up the acquaintance through rounding seasons and years, and from nature he drew lessons which he dropped as seed into the boy's heart, as unconscious of the great work he was doing as was Jabez himself. The boy throve and grew hardy. Companionship with older and rougher lads, sturdy fellows with wills of their own, made him sturdy too. A lad who could take a blow and give one on occasion, who would run a race and lose, and a second and third until he could win. But Bessie's gentle training was something very different from Sal's, and Jabez grew up tender as well as strong and bold. A persecuted kitten had taken refuge under Bessie's batting frame in the Foundlings' go-kart days, and in care for that kitten and for a wounded brown linnet brought home one Sunday, he learned humanity. Matthew's lads were given to bird nesting, and Matt himself saw no harm in it, but when that young linnet's wing was broken in a scuffle for the nest stolen from a clump of brushwood, Simon read the robbers such a homily they had never heard in their young lives, and, as a corollary, he took the bird home to be fed and nursed by Bess and Jabez till it could fly, an event which never came about. In hot weather the lads pulled off clogs and stockings. There were no trousers to turn up, they wore breeches, and waded into pools and brooks, and Jabez would be no whit behind. On one of these occasions, either the current was too strong for the venturesome child, or the gravel slipped from under his foot, or his companions pushed him, no matter which, but in he went, and, but for the presence of Simon, would have been drowned. Simon had been born on the river banks, and could swim like a fish. At once he resolved that Jabez should learn to do the same, and begin at once. "You see, Bess, if I hadn't been there, he'd have been drowned as sure as water's wet, and third time pays off for all. So he mun learn to tak care on himself the next time he marlocks, that is gambles, among the Jack Sharps." Jabez was not 6 years old when Simon Clegg gave him and the young Coopers their first lesson in swimming, in a delightful and sequestered part of Smedley Vale, where the Irk was clear and bright. He had shown them, nearer home, how a frog used its limbs, and then, after a few preliminary evolutions to show how a man used his, took the lad on his back, and, after swimming with him a while, shook him off into the water to flounder about for himself. Bess was often left at home on Sundays after that, and Jabez was not merely the better for his bath, but by the time he was 8 years old, was a fearless swimmer. Yet, although these country rambles had become an institution, Simon Clegg never neglected his Sabbath duties. Sunday morning was sure to see him, clean-shaven in his best suit, with Jabez by the hand, and mild-eyed Bess beside, on the free seats of the old church, under the eye of parsons and churchwardens. And Jabez, if he could understand little of the service, could gather in a sense of the beautiful, from the grand old architecture, from the swell of the solemn organ, the harmonious voices of the choristers, of the blue-coat boys in the Chetham gallery over the churchwarden's pew, and of the green-coat children farther on. Then the silver mace carried before the parson was a thing to wonder at, and fill him with awe, and no one could tell how the clerical robes and choristers' surplices transfigured common mortals in his admiring eyes. Those years of Jabez Clegg's young life had been full of a history for Manchester and Europe. The town had grown as well as the foundling. Invention had been busy. Volunteer regiments had been one by one disbanded. A daily newspaper was started, and peaceful arts flourished. Then, ere another year expired, Napoleon declared the British Isles in a state of blockade. British subjects on French soil, whether civil or military, to be prisoners of war. British commodities lawful spoil. And so war, red-handed war, broke loose once more. Again Manchester rose up in arms to defend country and commerce. A loyalty fund of £22,000 was raised for the support of government. No fewer than 9 separate volunteer corps sprang from the ashes of the old ones, and the town was one huge garrison. The commander of one regiment, the Loyal Masonic Rifle Volunteer Corps, Colonel Hanson, a remarkable man in many ways, was distinguished by a command from George III to appear at court in full regimentals and with his hat on. Messrs. Pickford offered to place at the disposal of government 400 horses, 50 wagons, and 28 boats. Loyal townsmen, with more money than courage of their own, sought to stimulate that of others by sending gold medals flying amongst the officers of the volunteer corps. The British volunteer came from the press of Harrop in the marketplace, and once more the music of drum and trumpet was in the ascendant. To crown the whole, Manchester, which had never been called upon to entertain British royalty since Henry VII looked in upon the infant town, was visited in 1804 by Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, commander of the North West District, and his son, to review this Lancashire volunteer army, and the whole town was consequently in a ferment of excitement. Nothing was thought of or talked of but the visit of the Duke and Prince and the coming review, the more so as reports differed respecting the appointed site. Market Street, Manchester, which George Augustus Sala has commemorated as one of the streets of the world, was then Market Street Lane, a confused medley of shops and private houses, varying from the low and rickety black and white tenement of no pretensions to the fine mansion with an imposing frontage and ample space before. but the thoroughfare was in places so very narrow that 2 vehicles could not pass, and pedestrians on the footpath were compelled to take refuge in the doorways from the muddy wheels which threatened damage to dainty garments, while the whole was ill paved and worse lighted. At the corner where it opens a vent for the warehouse traffic of High Street, then stood a handsome new hotel, the Bridgewater Arms, in front of which a semicircular area was railed off with wooden posts and suspended chains. Within this area, on the bright morning of April the 12th, 2 sentinels were placed, who, marching backwards and forwards, crossed and recrossed each other in front of the hotel doors, tokens that the royal duke and his suite had taken up their quarters within. Beyond the semicircle of chain posts, mounted horsemen kept back the concourse of spectators, which pressed closely on the horses' heels. Among the crowd was Simon Clegg with Jabez mounted on his shoulders, albeit he was a somewhat heavy load. Simon was a man of peace, but he was a staunch believer in royalty, and that, quite as much as the spectacle, had drawn him thither. It was a mild and cheery April morn. The windows of the upper room in which sat the prince, the centre of a brilliant circle, were open, and the loyal multitude feasted their unaccustomed eyes with the sight. As Jabez looked on in a child's ravishment, a little dark-haired, dark-eyed girl, some 6 or 7 years old, turned sharply round the narrow street by the side of the hotel, on the flags where there was no chain to bar, passing unquestioned the sentinel on guard, who, seeing only a well-dressed solitary child in white muslin, with a sash and hat ribbons of pink satin, concluded that she belonged to the hotel. Once there, she asked fearlessly, "Where is Prince William? I want to see Prince William." Then the sentinel began to question, but the little maid had but one reply, "I want Prince William." The soldier would have turned her back, but the disputation had attracted attention in the room above. An officer's head was thrust out. "What's the matter?" asked he. "I want to see the prince. I want to know." "Bid the little lady come up hither." And the little lady went up, all unconscious of state etiquette or ceremonial. An officer in rich uniform with jewels on his breast took her on his knee and asked what she wanted with Prince William. "Oh, Mamma and my aunts are wanting ever so to know if the review is going to be on Campfield or on Sale Moor. And Aunt Ellen says it's to be in one place and Mamma thinks it's the other, and so, as I was dressed first, I just slipped out at the back door and ran here to ask Prince William himself, for I thought he would be sure to know." The gentleman laughed heartily, and the others followed suit. "And who is your mamma, my dear?" "My mamma is Mrs. Chadwick, and I'm Ellen Chadwick, and we live in Oldham Street." "Oh, indeed. And why are the ladies so anxious to know where the prince holds the review?" asked the officer, on whose knee she sat. "Ah, that's just it. If he reviews at Sale Moor, he will go past our house, and then we shall see all the soldiers from our own windows. Won't it be fine?" Another gentleman asked what the ladies were doing when she left, and I'm afraid Ellen made more revelations about their toilets than were strictly necessary, for the laughter was prolonged. She did not, however, lose sight of her self-imposed mission. Struggling from her seat, she said, "Oh, please do tell me where is Prince William. I must go home, and I do so want to know." "Tell your mamma, Miss Ellen," said he, smiling, "that the prince will review at Sale Moor. And take this, my dear, for yourself," putting a shilling — shillings at that time were perfectly plain from overlong use — in her hand. "Oh, thank you. But are you sure, quite sure, it is Sale Moor?" "Quite sure." The little damsel set off, as much elated with her news as with her shilling. As she ran briskly down the broad steps and beyond the barrier, she came in contact with Simon, who made way for her exit, and as she looked up smiling to thank him, a glance rested for a moment on the boy he carried, but no spark of recognition flashed into the eyes of either. and no one in all that crowd saw any connection between that dainty white-frocked, pink-slippered, pink-sashed miss and the rough lad in the patched suit, a Clough's cast-off, and wooden clogs. Chapter 6. To martial music. A second time Jabez and Ellen saw each other ere the day was out. She had rushed home with eager feet and eyes through back streets to startle Mrs. Chadwick, her newly married sister, Mrs. Ashton, and a bevy of friends with the confident assurance that the review would be at sale, and to confirm it by a display of the plain shilling which an ossifer had given her. New Cross, where the volunteers assembled, was not then a misnomer. A market cross occupied the centre space between the four wide thoroughfares, of which Oldham Street is one, and the open area was considerable. The trumpets' bray, the tramp of troops, were heard long before the brilliant cavalcade was set in motion, and every window, every house in Oldham Street, all good private residences of the Gower Street stamp, held its quota of heads and eyes, and costumes as brilliant as the eyes. The house of Mr. Chadwick was situated near the lower end, and commanded a good view of the infirmary, its gardens and pond in Piccadilly. Today, however, the royal party and the volunteers, many of whom had friends looking out for them, were the only prospect worth a thought, and as they marched proudly on, to the gayest of gay tunes, kerchiefs waved, heads nodded, and eyes sparkled with delight and pleasure. As the Duke of Gloucester and his suite rode by, their chargers prancing to the music, Ellen, mounted on a chair by the window, between Mrs. Ashton and her mother, suddenly pointed to an officer in their midst, resplendent with stars and orders, and in an ecstasy of delight screamed out, "Mamma, mamma, that's the gentleman that gave me the shilling." The little treble voice pierced even through the clamorous music. A noble head was bowed, a plumed hat was raised and lowered until it swept the charger's mane. "Why, child, that is Prince William!" was the simultaneous exclamation, as all the eyes from all the houses across the street were turned in wonderment to see the Chadwicks so distinguished, and Simon, who, still carrying Jabez, was trying to keep pace with the troops, wondered too. Moreover, he recognized the lady and the little girl, though seen but once, for he earned his own living, such as it was, and had been too proud to call on the Chadwicks to say how his daughter fared, lest they should think he sought charity. "Jabez, lass, sithee, yont's lady and little lass has brought you home when you went seeing soldiers afore." And Jabez from his shoulder perch looked up at the little bright-eyed brunette, to remember the white frock and pink ribbons he had seen at the Bridgewater, but nothing beyond. The man's exclamation and attitude had at the same time attracted Mrs. Chadwick, who, smiling down on him and Jabez, spoke to Ellen, and she, reminded of the little baby who had been saved from drowning in a cradle, looked down and in the fullness of her new importance nodded too. The momentary stoppage called forth a loud objurgation as a reminder from Sally Cooper, who was in advance with Matthew and such of her bigger lads as could step out, and Simon, equally anxious not to lose sight of the royal party, hurried on. But Salemoor is beyond the confines of Lancashire, and Simon found the 5 miles stiff walking, with a child nearly 6 years old on his shoulders, and Master Jabez had to descend from his seat and trudge on his own feet. This caused them to lag behind their friends, Sally insisting on Matt's keeping up with the soldiers, in order that they might get a good place on the moor, and they were thus separated. Bess had remained at home. Never again could she look on marching troops without a pang. Salemoor was alive with expectant sightseers. Stands and platforms had been erected for the accommodation of those who could afford and cared to pay. There was a sprinkling of heavy carriages and a crowd of carts, but the mass of spectators were on foot, vehicular locomotion being of very limited capacity. Of these latter were the Coopers and Cleggs, of course. Sally, with the elders of her turbulent brood, had reached the ground in time to be deafened by the score of cannon Lord Wilton's artillery fired as a salute to Princeton. She had planted herself firmly against one of the supports of an elevated platform where the crowd of hero worshippers was densest. She was tightly jammed and crushed against the woodwork, but what matter? She had a fine sight of the field, and as she watched the evolutions of the volunteers, congratulated herself and Matthew on having left that crawling cleggan brat so far behind. Almost as she spoke, there was a faint crackle, then another, and a yielding of the post against which she leaned, a loud crash, a chorus of shrieks, half drowned by music and musketry, and the whole platform was down with the living freight it had borne, and she was down with it. The fashion, wealth, and beauty of Cheshire and South Lancashire had their representatives amongst that struggling, swooning, writhing, shrieking, groaning mass of humanity, heaped and huddled in indiscriminate confusion, with uptorn seats, posts, and draperies. Strange to say, only one person was killed outright, that is, on the spot, for in its downfall the stand bore with it many of the throng beneath. But of the injured and the shaken, those who went to hospital and home to linger long and die at last, history has kept no record. Amongst these, this story tells of two differing in all but sex. Mrs. Aspinall, ever frail and delicate, was borne to her carriage, with whole limbs but insensible, her husband and their son Lawrence both uninjured by her side. Physicians were in attendance and never left her until she was safely lodged in her own luxurious chamber overlooking Hardwick Green, and could be pronounced out of immediate danger. Sally Cooper, with a sprained ankle, a dislocated shoulder, and many internal bruises, was placed in a light cart on a bed of straw procured from a neighbouring farm, with another of the injured, and carried to the Manchester Infirmary to try the skill and the patience of the doctors and nurses. Neither recovered. The unwounded lady, sorely shaken, succumbed to the shock her nervous system had received, and Master Lawrence, already petted and wilful, was left to be still further spoiled by his widowed father and Kitty, his mother's old nurse. Sally, strong of frame and will, impatient of pain and of restraint, was restive under the surgeon's hands, and defeated their efforts to ascertain her injuries. She exhausted herself with shrieks and cries, tossed about and disturbed bandages, rejected physic, which she called poison, and soon put her case beyond the cure of physicians. Too late she became sensible of her own folly. Then, when recovery was impossible, she repented of many misdeeds, and of none more than her slander of poor Bess. And thus it was, when the mother was taken from the head of Cooper's home, Bess's kind heart yearned to help the disconsolate man and his troop of children. Fortunately, the eldest was a girl of 16, and there was a younger girl of 10. Both of these had gone out to work, but now Molly had to stay at home and try to keep all right and tight there, and here Bess came to her aid. Without scolding or brawling, she put the girl into the way of doing things quickly and quietly. She encouraged her to persevere, so that her cleanly mother should detect no eyesores when she came home restored. She tried to persuade the boys to be less refractory, to help not to irritate their sister, and somehow Cooper's home began to miss Sal, much as one misses a whirlwind. The kindness of Bess O'Symes was duly reported to the infirmary patient, and at first chafed her sorely. She hated to be under obligations, and to that lass of all others. But Bess, leaving her own work, and the loss of an hour meant the loss of an hour's earnings, herself went to see Sally, and such was the influence of her gentle voice and touch that Sally's chagrin imperceptibly wore away. Towards the last she grew delirious, raved of Bess and Tom and forgiveness, and in the short calm preceding dissolution, confessed to Matt Cooper and the attendant nurse that she had cast a slur on Bess Clegg's good name, had made Tom Hume believe that Simon had taken the lass from Skinner's yard to hide her shame, that everybody in the yard knew that Bess had a child, and that she had bade him inquire for himself, and almost her last word was a hope that Bess would forgive her. Matthew Cooper himself hardly forgave his dead wife. How, therefore, should he carry this confession to Bess and ask her to forgive? He took a medium course, and after a few days' consideration, while they and the rest of the tanners were eating their bagging, a workman's luncheon so-called from the bag it is or was usually carried in, sat down beside Simon on a bundle of thick leather, and told him as well as he was able. Simon was troubled, but he was not vindictive. He would have been less than a man had he not been bitter against the cruel woman who had causelessly wrecked his good daughter's life. But he was sorry for Matt, and broke out into no revilings. The woman was dead. The ill she had done had been fearfully punished, and neither curses nor reproaches could affect her or undo the mischief. He left his cheese and jannock on the hides untasted, drew his hand across his forehead, and went down to the riverside and across the wooden bridge for a breath of fresh air and a waft of fresh thought. He was only a rugged tanner, but he had a heart within his breast. He had a daughter on his hearth, with a great wound in her heart, a blast on her good name, and he was called upon to forgive the author of this mischief. Simon had long been used to commune with his own heart. He had built up a wall round it with the leaves of that one book on his bureau, and whenever he was in doubt or difficulty, he read the precepts inscribed upon that wall. He went back to Cooper, whose appetite had been no better than his own. "I mun think this hour, Matt. I canna say I forgive your Sal all at a dash. Who's done that as may never be undone while thee and me's alive, and I cannot frame to say as I forgive her, like, all of a sudden, and I mun think it o'er before aught be said to our Bess, poor wench." A week elapsed before the subject was broached again. Then Simon spoke to Matthew as they were leaving the tannery yard. "Come into Queen Anne, Matt, and have a jill. I've summat to say to thee." There was nobody in the tap room. They sat down to their half-pint horns of ale. Times were too hard to afford deeper draughts, and Simon said, "I've been thinking all this week, and as I canna forgive your Sal, grady like, I'll na put the same temptation in way of our Bess. Who'd better think Tom's taken up with some other wench than ha' the shame of knowing lad's turned her up in disgrace? Who's getting up worse o' her trouble, and I'm not going to break her out outright and maybe set her again little Jabez into bargain." Matthew could but assent to Simon's proposition, but Simon had not said all his say. "But I'm not going to sit down with me hands in me lap, and that great lump of dirty slutch sticking to my lass. You mun help me find out where Tom Hume's getting to, and help to set all straight afore I forgive your Sal, though he'll be dead and gone." "Wi' all my heart," responded Matt, and he gave his huge hand to Simon in token thereof. When the Duke of Gloucester inspected the volunteers at Hardwick on the 30th of September that same year, not one of the people I have linked together witnessed the show. The blinds were down at Mr. Aspinall's to shut out a sight, the like of which had made him a widower, and within the darkened nursery, wilful, obstreperous Lawrence fought and kicked and bit at old Kitty, because she kept him within doors and from the windows at his father's command. There was a christening party in Mosley Street, at the Ashtons, at which not only the Chadwicks but the Reverend Joshua Brooks, who had that day named the infant Augusta, were present. They had selected a public occasion for their private festival. It was a grand affair. Mr. Ashton was a small-ware manufacturer in an extensive way of business, his house and warehouse occupying a large block of buildings at the corner of York Street, and the baby Augusta, born the previous month, was a first child, his wife being younger than himself considerably. Miss Helen, too, was there, a wonderful shilling through which a hole had been drilled, suspended from her neck like an amulet. Simon and Matt had given up their holiday to fruitless inquiries after Tom Hume, and Jabez, after a stand-up fight with the boy in the yard in defence of his kitten, had come to have his bleeding nose and bruised forehead doctored by Bess, who shed over him the tears long gathering in their fountains for Tom Hume's defection. And somehow, at that stylish christening feast, where the baby Augusta was a personage of importance almost as great as the celebrated Miss Kilmansegg, the orphan Jabez and his fosterers came on the table for discussion along with the dessert. Mrs. Chadwick, Mr. Clough, and Joshua Brooks concurring in the opinion mooted by the lady that something should be done to relieve the worthy tanner and his daughter of the cost and trouble of maintaining the boy as he grew older and would want educating. That they should talk of the cost of maintenance when bread was a shilling a loaf was no marvel, but that education should be named as a necessity for one of nobody's children can only be cited as a proof that either the boy's strange introduction to Manchester or Simon's strange generosity had excited an interest in both beyond the common run. Yet that something was vague. The only definite and practicable view of the subject was held by Joshua Brooks, and he kept his opinion to himself. Chapter 7. The Reverend Joshua Brooks. Joshua Brooks had a child's love for toffee and other sweetmeats. These he purchased, or obtained without purchase, from an old woman as odd and eccentric as himself, a Mrs. Clewes, who occupied a bow-windowed shop in Half Street, which literally overlooked the churchyard, 3 or 4 steps having to be mounted by her customers. And how numerous were her customers, and how great the demand for her toffee, lozenges, and humbugs, may be judged from the fact that her workmen and apprentices used up 8 or 9 tons of sugar every week. Yet she was apparently only a shopkeeper, and had begun business in a very humble way. But she was persevering and industrious, and success followed. She was active and energetic, and expected those around her to be the same. Yet she was kind to them, as may be supposed, for she gave every Sunday a good dinner to 14 old men and women, on whom fortune had looked unkindly, waiting upon them herself, and never tasting her own dinner until her pensioners had dined. Regular in her own attendance at the old church, she required her household to be regular too, though she left them little enough time to express, possibly because her own toilet was so scant. The dress in which she presented herself at church was certainly unique for a woman of wealth. Her gown of sober stuff was well worn. A mob cap, a fashion which came in with the French Revolution, adorned her head, over which, by way of bonnet, a brown silk handkerchief was tied. On rare, very rare occasions, an old black silk bonnet covered all. Joshua Brooks, at odds with his clerical brethren, with his pupils, and half the world besides, was on good terms with Mrs. Clewes. Rough, prompt, and uncompromising was she. Rough, irritable, and unmannerly was he. Both unpromising, hard-husked nuts, with sweet and tender kernels. So rough few ever suspected the soft heart. Yet the woman who fed the poor before herself, and the learned clergyman who had a fancy for pigeons, and who cherished the drunken and abusive old crippled shoemaker, his father, to the last, must have intuitively known the inner life of each other. The day following Augusta Ashton's christening, it fell within the round of the Reverend Joshua's duty to read the burial service over a dead townswoman in the churchyard. And now occurred one of those incidents in which the ludicrous and the profane blended, and brought impulsive Joshua into disfavour. As was not infrequently the case, he broke off in the midst of the service, left the mourners and the coffin beside the open grave, threw his legs over a low wall, and mounting the steps into the confectioner's shop, said, "Here, quick, dame, give me some more round drops for me cough." On his entrance, Mrs. Clewes broke off a narrative over which she and her shopwoman were laughing heartily, in order to reach the required drops, which went into a paper without weighing, and for which no payment was tendered. Back he strode over the churchyard wall to resume the interrupted ceremonial. It must here be observed that Joshua had remarkably shaggy eyebrows, overhanging his quick eyes like penthouses, and that it was the wont of the schoolboys and others to annoy him by drawing their fingers significantly over their own. A young sweep sat upon the churchyard wall to witness the funeral, and, young imp of Satan that he was, he could not forbear drawing a thumb and forefinger over each brow, full in Joshua's sight. Just as he reached the passage, I heard a voice from heaven saying, the shaggy eyebrows contracted. He roared out, "Knock that little black rascal off the church wall." The mischievous little blackamoor was off, with a beadle after him, and the eccentric chaplain, whom no sense of irreverence seemed to strike, concluded the ceremony with no further interruption. At its close, Mr. Aspinall and another mourner took the clergyman to task for his disrespect to the remains of the deceased Mrs. Aspinall, whose obsequies had been so irregularly performed. They said nothing of disrespect to the divinity profaned. Their own feelings and importance had been outraged, and they forgot all else, even by the dust and ashes in the gaping grave, and little Lawrence, cloaked and hooded, forgot his grief in watching the chase after the sweep. "How dare you, sir, give way to these indecencies at the funeral of my wife? 'Tis been most indecorous and insulting, both to the dead and her afflicted relatives." "She's had Christian burial, hasn't she?" gruffly interrogated Joshua. "Hardly," was the hesitating answer. "She's been laid in consecrated ground, and I've read the burial service over her. What more would you have? Some folk are never satisfied." Emptying half his horehound drops into the hand of Master Lawrence, Joshua turned on his heel, went to the chapter house to disrobe, and then back over the wall to Mrs. Clewes. "I say, dame, you were not at church on Sunday?" "No, Parson Brooks, I was in Liverpool." "Oh," grunted he, "in Liverpool? Sugar buying, I suppose." "Yeah, and a fine joke I've had." Joshua pricked up his ears. He did not object to a little fun. "You mun know I thought I'd give Branker, the new sugar broker, a trial, and I went there and asked to see samples. But the young whippersnapper of a salesman looked at me from top to toe, and, I suppose, reckoned up the value of me old black bonnet, me kerchief and much, and me old stuffed dress, and fancied my pockets must match my gown, for he was barely civil, and didn't seem to care for the trouble of showing samples. So I bade my young man good day, and said I'd call again." "And didn't, I suppose, just like a woman?" put in Joshua. "Oh, yeah, I did. I borrowed my landlady's silk gown and fine satin bonnet, and put on my lady's manners, and then Mr. Whippersnapper could show his samples, and his best manners, too. But when I gave my orders by tons and not hundredweights, he looked at me and looked again, as if he thought I'd escaped from a madhouse, and at last he began to and ah, and talk of large orders and cash payment and references, and I told him to make out the invoice and bring it, and when I pulled out this old leather pocket-book and counted banknotes to pay him down on nail, good gracious, how the fellow stared. I reckon I'll not need to borrow a silk dress when I give my next order. It was as good as a play." You women folk think yourselves wonderfully clever. But come, I can't waste my time here." Joshua had heard all he went for. "Give me £250 of humbugs, I threw half the other things away," said he. "I don't think it's much you'll throw away, Jotty," replied the old confectioner, with independent familiarity, as she weighed and parcelled the sweets, for which this time he put down the money. "It's much you know about it, Mother Clewes," he jerked out, as if throwing the words at her over his shoulder, as he turned to leave the shop, putting the package in one of the large pockets of his long flap waistcoat as he went. His own house, not more than 300 yards away, adjoined the grammar school, a red brick building with stone quoins, now darkened by time and smoke, one gable of which overhung the earth, the other pierced for 4 small pane windows almost confronting the antique Sun Inn at the acute angle of Long Millgate, and quite overlooking an open space flanked by the main entrance to the college. From this, the east wing of the college, it is separated by a plain iron gateway and palisades on the Millgate side, and by a low wall which serves as a screen from the river on the other side. The enclosed space between rails, wall, college, and the front of the school serving as a playground for such scholars as were willing to keep within bounds. It was divided into upper, middle, and lower schools, the last being in the basement, and designed for elementary instruction. The high and middle schools together occupied the same long room above this. Joshua Brooks, as second master, presided over the middle school, and surely never M.A. had so thankless an office. He was placed at a terrible disadvantage in the school, not altogether because he had risen from its lowest ranks, not altogether because a drunken foul-mouthed cripple interfered with their sport, or went railing to his son's domicile next door, not because he was unduly severe, other masters were that, but because his own eager thirst for knowledge as a boy had made him intolerant towards indolence, incredulous of incapacity, and his constitutional impatience and irritability made his harsh voice seem harsher when he reproved a dullard. He lost his self-command, and with that went his command over others. Meaning to be affable to the poor, from whose ranks he sprang, he became familiar, and they reciprocated the familiarity so fully as to draw down the contempt of his confreres. He was a man to be respected, and they slighted him, a man to be honoured, and they snubbed him. What wonder, then, that eccentricities grew like barnacles on a ship's keel, or that the boys failed in obedience and respect to a master when their elders set them the example. This defence of a misunderstood man has not taken up a tithe of the time he gave to his refractory class, to whom he went straight away from the confectioners, whose humbugs had melted considerably, not wholly down his own throat, before the hour when the boys closed their Latin grammars and Greek lexicons, and poured as if they were mad down the steps and through the gate to the road. Yet even the sweets he gave to the attentive did not conciliate. They only made the intractable more defiant, and the recipients felt they were bribed. Warned by the uproar of a large school in motion as well as by the long case clock, Tabitha, his one servant, had a master's tea ready for him the instant he came in from the school, as he generally did, fagged and jaded with the growl of a baited bear. That day he simply put his head into the house and bawled, "Tea ready, Tab," and without waiting for an answer went on, "Keep it hot till I get back." Then, closing the door, took his way eastwards down Long Millgate. His journey was not a long one. He tended at the bottom of a yard where a sad, pale-faced young woman was switching monotonously at a mass of downy cotton, and listening at the same time to the equally monotonous drawl of a youngster in the throes of monosyllabic reading. "Get larning, lad, get larning. Larning's a great thing. You shan read in this big picture book when you can spell gradely," had been Simon's precept and inducement, and Jabez, to whom that big pictorial Bible was a mysterious unexplored crypt, did try with all his little might. J-A-K-K, Jack, was a good boy. "And I hope you're a good boy as well as Jack," said Joshua Brooks abruptly, as he put his head into the room and put a stop to the lesson at the same time. "But heyday," observing the swollen nose and bruised forehead, "you've been in the wars. Good boys don't fight." "Then what did Bill Barnes throw stones at our pussy for? Good boys don't hurt kittens," said Jabez, nothing daunted. Bess explained. Quoth Joshua, when she had finished. "He's fond of his kitten, is he?" And drawing Jabez towards him by the shoulder with one finger uplifted as a caution, he looked down on the shrinking child and said impressively, "Never fight if you can help it, Jabez. But if you fight to save a poor dumb animal from ill usage, or to protect the weak against the strong, Jotty Brooks is not the man to blame you. Here, lad," and into the pinafore of Jabez went the remainder of the humbugs. He patted the boy on the head, bade him get on with his reading. He did not know what good fortune might come of it, told him to come regularly to church, to love God and God's creatures, and went away, leaving Bess to prepare her father's porridge. Tea was from 12 to 16 shillings a pound, and beyond their reach. Almost on the threshold, he encountered Simon. "Can't you keep that young sprig out of mischief? If he begins fighting and quarrelling at 6 years old, what will he do when he's 16? He cried gruffly, as he brushed past the teller, and was far up the yard before the man could think of a reply. A couple of young pigeons were sent for Jabez about a week after, with a large bag of stale cakes and bread to feed them with. The name of the sender was unknown, but anyone acquainted with the habits of Joshua Brooks, who contracted for Mrs. Clusway's pastry to fill the crops of his own feathered colony, would not have been troubled to guess. Simon stroked his raspy chin and seemed dubious, cost of keep being a question. But Jabez looked so wistful, his foster father borrowed tools and answered the appeal by making a triangular coat for them, and Jabez found fresh occupation in their care. Yet occupation was not lacking, young as he was. He could fetch and carry, run short errands, and help Bess to clean. Their living room no longer waited a week to be swept and dusted. Jabez did it every day, standing on a chair to reach the top of the bureau, where lay the cynosure of his young eyes. He still took his Sunday lessons in field or stream with Simon, and through the week clambered up from monosyllables to dissyllables with Bess. Chapter 8. The Blue Coat School. The children of the poor begin early to earn their bread. Legislature has stepped in to regulate the age and hours for labour in manufacturing districts, and to provide education for the humblest. Jabez Clegg was not born in these blissful times, and he only narrowly escaped the common lot. He was not 8 years old, yet Simon, on whom war prices pressed as heavily as on his neighbours, began to discuss with Bess the necessity for sending the lad to Simpson's factory, where Arkwright's machinery was first set in motion. "He mun go as soon as New Year takes a fair grip," decided Simon, and 1805 was at its last gasp as he said it. But the New Year brought Jabez a reprieve by the uncourtly hands of Joshua Brooks. Meeting Simon and Jabez at a stall in the apple market, where the better to bargain, he had laid down a pile of old classical school books. Joshua was a collector of these, which he retailed again to the boys at prices varying with his mood or his estimate of the purchaser's pocket. He accosted the former. "Well, old leather shanks, what are you going to make a young cheat the fishes there? I suppose it's to follow your own trade." He began to tan hides so early, and the glance which shot from under his shaggy brows caused the boy to blush and shrink behind his protector. Simon's eyes twinkled, but he shook his head as he answered, "Nay, Parson Brooks, we ain't thought of sending him to cotton factory, but it fair goes again the grain to send little chap through streets to work winter and summer wet or dry afore the sun's up and about his work. But we canna keep him bout it, times are so bad." Then what a stupid old leatherhead you must be not to think of the college, where he'd be kept and fed and clothed and educated. Educated, man, do you hear? Simon heard, and his eyes again twinkled and winked at the new idea presented to him. "Apprenticed?" he echoed with a long-drawn gasping breath. "Aye, and apprenticed." The parson, cramming his pockets with apples, for which he had higgled with much persistence, handed one to Jabez with the question, "How would you like to be a college boy, Jabez, and wear a long blue coat like that fellow yonder," pointing to a boy then crossing the market on an errand, "and learn to write and cipher as well as to read?" "If you please, and I'd like it, more nor out." His animated face was a clearer answer than his words. Joshua then read the lad a brief homily, to the effect that only good and honourable boys could find admission, winding up with, "If you're a very good lad, I'll see what can be done for you." He interrupted thanks with, Easter's very near, Sime, so you'll have to stir your stumps to prove that our honourable young friend came honourably into the world. I'll get the forms and fill them up for you, and his baptismal register too." He snatched up his boots and was off, the tassel of his collegiate cap and the cassock he wore flying loose as he hurried away, muttering to himself, "What an old fool I am to bother about the lad. I dare say he'll turn round and sting me in the end, like the rest of the snakes I've warmed. As great an idiot as old Dame Close." Chetham's College, or hospital, is a long, low, ancient stone edifice built on the rock above the mouth of the Irk, with 2 arms of unequal length stretching towards church and town, and embracing a large quadrangle used as a playground, which has for its fourth and southern boundary a good, useful garden. It is needless to grope upward from the time when the Saxon Thane built a fortified residence on its site. Sufficient for us that Thomas de la Warre, youngest son of the feudal Baron of Manchester, was brought up to the church, and in the 14th century inducted into the rectory of Manchester, his father being patron. His elder brother dying at the close of the century, the rector, a pious churchman, became baron, and then he put his power and wealth to sacerdotal use. He petitioned the king, obtained a grant to Collegiate Christ Church, erected the college, endowed it with lands, and here, at his death, the warden of the Collegiate Church had his residence. Of these wardens, the celebrated Dr. Dee, whose explorations into alchemy and other occult sciences brought him into trouble with Queen Elizabeth, was one. Dr. Dee's room is still extant in occupation of the governor. In 1580, at Crumpsall Hall, Humphrey Chetham was born, and he, a prosperous dealer in fustians, never marrying, at his own expense fed and clothed a number of poor boys, and by his will not only bequeathed a large sum of money to be expended in the foundation and endowment of a hospital for the maintenance, education, and apprenticing of 40 poor boys forever, but £1,000 to be expended in a library free to the public, the first free library in Britain. The estate was vested in fees, and with them lay the power alike to elect boys and officials. From the townships of Manchester, Droylsden, Crumpsall, Bolton-le-Moors and Turton, the boys were to be elected between the ages of 6 and 10, and were required to be of honest, industrious parents, and neither illegitimate nor diseased, and baptismal registers had to be produced. They had to be well maintained, well trained, and carefully apprenticed at 14, a fee of £4, a large sum in Humphrey Chetham's time, being given with them. The church wardens and overseers were to prepare lists of boys, doubling the number of vacancies, stating their respective claims, which lists they had to sign. Easter Monday was the period for election, after which the fees dined together in Dr. Dee's quaintly carved room. Joshua Broots was as good as his word. He procured a blank form from the governor, and Simon, being no great scholar, filled it in for him. He found him in the baptismal register, without charging the regulation shilling, got the name of Jabez inserted in the churchwarden's list, and such influence as he had with fees he exerted to the utmost, for the case was one involving doubt and difficulty. Nor had Simon Clegg been idle. He and his crony Matthew scoured Smedley and Crumpsall, and more successful than in their quest for Tom New, discovered the nurse who presided at the birth of Jabez. Her testimony, so far as it went, was important. He had interested both Mr. and Mrs. Clough in the election of the foundling, and where the influence of the gentleman failed, that of the lady prevailed, so that when the important Easter Monday arrived, 2/3 of the fees were fully acquainted with his peculiar case, and more or less impressed in his favour. It was on the 18th of April, bright, sunny, joyous. Compared with its present proportions, Manchester then was but as a cameo brooch on a mantle of green, and that green was already starred with daisies, buttercups, primroses, and cowslips. By wells and brooks, daffodil and jonquil hung their heads and breathed out perfume. Bush and tree put out pale buds and fans of promise. The titlark sang. The cuckoo, to use a village phrase, had eaten up the mud, and the town was alive with holiday-makers from all the country round about. It was the great college anniversary, not only election day, but one set apart for friends to visit Bluecoat boys already on the foundation, and for the curious public to inspect the Chatham Museum. The main entrance in Millgate, said to be arched with the jawbone of a whale, and the smaller gate on Hunt's Bank were both thrown open. A stream of people of all grades in festival array poured in and out, and college cap and gown seemed to be ubiquitous. The pale sad widow or widower holding an orphan boy by the trembling hand, the uncle or next of kin to the doubly orphan candidate were there, standing in a long line ranged against the building, and representing hopes and fears and eventualities little heeded by the shifting stream of gazers. For the previous week Mrs. Clews and her assistants had been working night and day. Her shop was in a state of siege. Every boy and every boy's friend seemed to have pocket money to spend, and to want to spend it over her counter. Then it was the great wedding day of the year, and the churchyard swarmed like a hive. From every one of the many public houses round college and church, music and mirth, clattering feet, and loud-voiced laughter issued. The apple tree, the packhorse, the ring of bells, the blackamoor's head, were filled to repletion with wedding guests, whilst the college inn and the old Sun Inn held a less boisterous quota of the collegians' friends and relatives. On those wet days when outdoor play was impossible, the boys, besides darning their stockings, occupied their spare hours in carving spoons and apple scrapers out of bone, in working balls and pincushions, in fanciful devices with coloured worsted, and a stitch locally known as colleging. And with these, on Easter Monday and at Whitsuntide, they reaped a harvest of pocket money, having liberty to offer them for sale. And when it is remembered that our notable female ancestors, both poor and rich, wore indoors a pincushion and sheathed scissors suspended at their sides, it is not to be wondered that these found ready purchasers as memorials of the visit. But in that college yard were anxious and expectant as well as buoyant faces, and there in that line, waiting to be called when their turn came, stood Jabez between Simon Clegg and Bess, with Matthew and the nurse on either hand, and ever and anon their eyes went up to the oriel window which faced the main entrance, for in the room it lighted, the arbiters of the boy's destiny sat in judgment on some other orphan's claim. At length the summons came for Jabez Clegg. With palpitating hearts, for any body of men with irresponsible powers is an awful tribunal, they passed under the arched portal at the western angle of the building, following their guide past the doors of the great kitchen on the right hand and the boys' refectory and Dr. D's room on the left, up the wide stone staircase with its massive carved oak balusters, along the gallery at once library and museum, where gawping holiday folk followed a blue-coat cicerone past shelves and glass cases and compartments separated for readers' quiet study by carven bookshelf screens, hearing but heeding little of the parrot roll the boys checked off. Here's Oliver Crumley's sword, there's a lodestone, there's Hairy Mon, there's the skeleton of a mon, and so forth, but following their own guide to the nail-studded oaken door of the Fifi's room, that door which might open to hope, only to close on disappointment. The Fifi's room, now the reading room of the library, deserves more than a passing notice. It is a large, square, antique chamber, with a deeply recessed oriel window opposite the door, containing a table and seats for readers. There are carved oak buffets of ancient date, ponderous chairs, and still more ponderous tables, one of which is said to contain as many pieces as there are days in the year. Dingy-looking portraits of eminent Lancashire divines stare at you from the walls, but the left-hand wall contains alone the benevolent presentment of Humphrey Chetham, the large-hearted, clear-headed founder. Its place is over the wide chimney-piece, which holds an ample grate, and on either hand it is flanked by the carved effigy of a bird. The one, a pelican feeding its young brood with its own blood, the other, a cock, which is said, and truly, to crow when it smells roast beef. But we smell the Fifi's dinner, and must not delay the progress of Jabez and his friends. A large body of Fifis were present, many in the uniforms of their special volunteer regiments. "So this is the little fellow who was picked up asleep in a cradle during the flood of August 1799, observed rather than inquired one of the gentlemen who appeared as spokesman. "Yea, your honours," answered Simon, making a sort of bow. "Who can witness to that?" "I can, and I can," responded Simon and Malc Cowle in a breath. "It were us as got him out at water." "Anyone else?" Bess stepped forward modestly. "He were put in my arms on Tanner's Bridge, and I browed him up ever sin'." "Have you never sought for his parents?" "Aye, many a time. Matt and me have spent many a day a seeking 'em," said Simon promptly, "and we could find no more than that paper towels," referring to a sheet in the questioning Fifi's hand. "Then how do you date the boy's age with such precision?" The nurse now sidled confidently to the front. "If it please your honour's worship, I were called to stiff back Nan's daughter in last pinch when hoo were like to die, and that little chap were born afore I left, and that were on 5th of May 1799. I know it, for I broke my arm very next day." "And the mother died?" "Yea, afore the week were out." "And you think she was lawfully married? Where was her husband?" "Aye, that's it, who had a guinea gold wedding ring on. And old Nan said it were a sad thing lass had ever got wedded, and more at same sort. And I got out of her that they'd been wedded at Crumsall, and all neighbours knew as th' husband had a letter to fetch him to Liverpool, and had niver come back. Anybody in Smedley knows that." "And you think they were honest, industrious people?" "Aye, that they were, but rayther stiff in joints, you know. Seemed to think themselves too good to talk to folk like, and maybe we'd a known lad's name and all belonging to him. They owed nobody now, and I were paid for my job." Jabez was called forward and examined, and he came pretty well out of the fire. They found that he could read a little, knew part of his catechism, and they saw that he was a well-behaved, intelligent boy, with truthful dark grey eyes and a reflective brow. There was a long and animated discussion during which the boy and his friends were bidden to retire. It was contended that the marriage of the boy's parents was not proven, that his very name was dubious, and that the founder's will was specific on that head. Then one of Mrs. Clough's friends rose and grew eloquent. He asked if they were to interpret the will of the great and benevolent man whose portrait looked down upon them by the spirit or by the letter, if they themselves did not feel that the boy was eligible, as the nurse's testimony went to prove, that this was a case peculiarly marked out for their charitable construction, and he wound up by inquiring if they thought Humphrey Chetham would expect his representatives to be less humane, less charitable, less conscientious in dealing with a bounty not their own, than that poor, struggling, hard-working tanner and his daughter, who had maintained and cherished the orphan in spite of cruelly hard times, and still more cruel slander. And then he told as an episode what Sally Cooper had confessed, and how and why Bess had lost her lover. This turned the quivering scale. Jabez Clegg and his friends were called in. The verdict which changed the current of his life was pronounced. Jabez Clegg was a blue-coat boy. Before the night was out, while the floodgates of all their hearts were open, Matthew Cooper, though nearly 20 years her senior, asked Bess to be his wife.